Made to Thrive Nation, I've got one of our very, very own South Africans with us. He's trained in Cape Town at the University of Cape Town as a medical doctor, and then went on to the US to do a master's in public health at the Johns Hopkins University. He's a public health advocate, and it's a special honor to have him on the show because he's going to speak about the future of health and many interesting facts about what the health status is in this current crazy world. So it's a privilege and a pleasure to really welcome Dr. Derek Yach on the Made to Thrive show.
Wonderful to join with you, Steve. Real pleasure.
Brilliant. Give us a short backstory in just terms of your medical experience and the things that have interested you along a very varied and very special medical sort of career.
Thanks. And I think those listening will understand that I basically can't keep a job. That's the story of my career. Many years in South Africa, and started off during the final dark years of apartheid, when I was actually given a first huge opportunity on the eve of when Parliament announced that Black South Africans could move to the cities. When they made the announcement, they simultaneously knew that they had to address what were the fears then of the white South Africans, namely that infectious diseases would be brought in from the rural areas to the cities. So believe it or not, a couple of us were asked to create a large research program, which Parliament would fund immediately to address this. We didn't see that in the same way, but we realized that we needed to have good quality data on all diseases for the country and used the opportunity to create the Center for Epidemiological Research, which then funded enormous amounts of research in the universities, everything including the first birth cohort in Soweto, looking at how babies develop and thrive and what the major factors are influencing their development, and a range of stuff across infectious, non-infectious diseases that I think helped build the basis for what became the excellence South Africa eventually showed in HIV/AIDS. And when I finally left South Africa as the first South African to join WHO after apartheid, my colleague Slim Abdul Karim took over, and he became, I think, one of the leaders during the last pandemic, the COVID pandemic. So after being in South Africa, I went to the World Health Organization, and among the major things I focused on were chronic diseases and mental health. I led the early development of WHO's first and only treaty on tobacco control. We did a major piece of work to define what should be the nutrient guidelines in the food space, what should people be eating more of, less of, and so on, and issued a report called, boringly, 916. It became a galvanizing force for the food industry because we basically said you should have less sugar, less fat, less salt, less trans fats. And of course, the moment you say less, all the industries don't enjoy that, and they challenged us in many ways, but we went ahead. After about 10 years in Geneva, WHO, I went to Yale as professor of global health and did a number of things, eventually the Rockefeller Foundation. And from the Rockefeller Foundation, I was recruited by the incoming head of PepsiCo, Indra Nooyi, as her first recruit. And that was when colleagues in public health were fearful that I'd gone to the dark side, and wrote about this. And the main reason I went was because she really was an inspirational leader who made the point that if you lower salt, sugar, and fat in any of those products that they make, you will touch the lives of 2 billion people around the world. And instead of just talking about policy, you could actually have an impact on people's lives. And so while it was an interesting 5 years, I think it was meaningful in that the company committed to improving the healthfulness of products and so on, and we could talk about that later. I then was recruited again by an equally inspiring person, Adrian Gore, where Adrian approached me, and Vitality was starting to go global. And his vision was to have an institute in New York that helped build the base for what would become a lot of the global businesses, but to strengthen the science, to understand the importance of behavioral science, how we incentivize healthy behavior, and work with some of the leading academic institutions in the US and worldwide that was a fantastic period. And as you know, was and still is filled with energy. And his vitality age is probably 20 years below his chronological age due to his own fitness. And then I went off to go back to my interests in tobacco, and founded a foundation to address the end of smoking through harm reduction and cessation. And after 5 years there, and for the last 2 years, I've been doing independent consulting, focused really in 3 big areas that I still believe are critical: the food obesity nexus, mental health, which I see as a looming disaster for the world, and trying to end the work on smoking as well, but all with a higher focus on the technology options and the behavioral science options.
Brilliant. Well done. An incredible career and inspiring to many, how many people's lives you've changed. So let's go deep there. And I really want to talk about what the state of chronic diseases is globally. And I don't know if you know stats in South Africa, but I know in the US it's crazy. I think 50% of Americans have one chronic disease. 40% of Americans have multiple chronic diseases. So give us the current stats, and how are we going to beat the wave and the epidemic and the exponential increase in chronic disease?
Yeah, so again, it's always important for South Africans to realize that they were at the start of some of the really important thinking around how you prevent cardiovascular disease. And it's no longer spoken about, but there were projects in the Southern Cape among Afrikaans communities where the level of cardiovascular disease, both because of genetic reasons as well as because the diet was cardiovascular positive, smoking rates were in the sky, physical activity levels have dropped. And those studies under the name Chorus, funded by the MRC in the late 70s and 80s, were happening identically when Michigan and many parts of the world were saying, we don't have to just accept this. Lifestyle and behavior changes can have a difference. And for 10 years, these studies ran in South Africa and were among the best in the world. We've long forgotten about them. I mention it because that was before NCDs and chronic diseases became accepted as the dominant health risks worldwide. So we now know that about 75% of all deaths are due to a mixture of chronic diseases, of which cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer, chronic lung disease, and if you add in mental health, you go up even higher, are the dominant ones. I would give a little caution to people listening to say, well, isn't that a terrible thing that people are dying mainly of chronic diseases? Well, the question is, what else would you like to die of? And there really are only 3 big buckets that we use. Chronic diseases, the second big bucket is maternal and child health and infectious diseases. We don't want to die of those. And the third is violence, injuries, and trauma. The fact that the proportion is going up isn't bad in itself. The question is, at what age are people dying? And generally, the global picture's mixed. Cardiovascular disease death rates have been declining in most parts of the world for the last decade and a half, going down, not what we often hear. All of the metabolic conditions, though, associated with diet and obesity, particularly diabetes, chronic kidney disease, and some cancers caused by them, are going up. So you can already start seeing where the big problem lies. The issues related to tobacco are mixed. In some parts of the world, we're seeing a decline in smoking-related death and disease, but throughout most of the developing world, and South Africa still falls into that category, we have smoking rates approaching 30, 40, 50% among men, still low among women, and that constitutes a big risk. And then finally, the mental health category is rising just about everywhere we look. Depression, anxiety, and so on. Some parts of the world, we're seeing life expectancy, instead of going up, it's going down due to what are called diseases of despair, the mixture of alcohol, suicide, drug abuse. And we've never seen this in living memory, except in the post-Soviet Union. Now we're seeing it in parts of the US, Scotland, the UK, and I suspect even in parts of South Africa, we would see the trends going down. So on balance, and let me just end by saying that the maternal deaths and the early undernutrition and children's infections have come down dramatically. So I would say, as a public health person, we should be incredibly thankful and be very proud of the incredible progress being made overall, but recognize that we've got some major hotspots that need to be addressed, particularly this nexus of diet, nutrition, obesity on the one hand, and mental health on the other. And South Africa,
it just seems like, Derek, that possibly health span has come down. I don't know if you got those metrics. So obviously with infectious disease, I think in 1880, the life expectancy was like, 40. If you take out the infectious diseases that kill people, I think, it ended up being like life expectancy was 80. But if we look at health span in terms of when people are getting diagnosed with these chronic conditions, I don't think we've moved the needle much, have we, with regards to non-communicable diseases and preventing them and ensuring that our health span is far better than just lifespan.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I think it's only been in the last 20, 25 years that people have actually made that distinction properly. That it's not good enough to focus on mortality, but you want to look at quality of life and health span. That's again what Vitality does particularly well, the years lived with these conditions. And yes, you're right, we are seeing people living with chronic conditions for longer. And you started off by making the point that a very significant proportion of people over the age of 40 or 50 have 2, 3, 4, 5 multiple chronic conditions. A number of us did some work with Teva Pharmaceuticals over the last few years, where they wanted to understand how important is this issue of multiple chronic diseases. And everywhere we looked, we saw it was extremely high. And of course, you would have people with cardiovascular disease plus depression, diabetes plus an infectious disease. And the more you have multiple chronic conditions, the more complex it is, both in terms of medication adherence for the individual, diagnostics, the relationship to your physician, and the stress on the health system itself. And yet there's been very little attention paid to how do we deal with these multiple chronic conditions in a uniform way. The pandemic showed us that people who have 3, 4, 5, 6 multiple chronic conditions had a substantially higher risk of death and complications. And that's also very important because we always think of the pandemic in terms of the infectious disease issues. Here, it's actually obesity with cardiovascular, with depression that predicted death and complications. Yet in the post-pandemic world, we are not actually including the chronic disease preventive agenda. Basically, if we had to have a rigorous approach to chronic disease prevention, it's very unlikely we would have had the majority of the deaths we saw during the pandemic.
Sure, and I think just being in practice now 25 years in Sandton, in a very wealthy area in Johannesburg, looking at my patients, often come in with a significant chronic disease, 6 months of lifestyle interventions, changes, medication, just going through the whole process, often, dealing with their chronic disease or putting it in remission, autoimmune, whatever it is. But 9 months later, a year later, they're back to their old ways, regained the weight, or back to type 2 diabetic. It seems that people battle to sustain their transformation, even if they do get the right intervention. And these are in areas where people have resources and time. What is the way forward for humanity to deal and beat chronic disease? Because it just seems, and I know Vitality in itself, I don't know the latest data. We've got a mutual friend in Brett Tromp who was there for a long time. I don't know the specific data on Vitality, but what is the way forward to actually beating and preventing chronic disease?
Well, I think you're hinting at it. On the one hand, there's the response of the health system to value prevention and to be remunerated to actually give time to prevention, whether it's smoking, weight management, and so on. Secondly, I think that the innovations we're learning from Vitality around behavioral economics are profound. We know, as Adrian Gore would often say, is that people act in their worst long-term interest. It's called hyperbolic discounting. You have a short-term perspective. Think about when people go to a buffet. They're not thinking about the consequences of overeating and eating X, Y, and Z for what's going to happen a year or 2 or 3 years down the line. Or if it's a cold, miserable day, people will often say, let's stay in bed and not go to the gym or exercise. So because of that inherent human nature, these are not bad people, these are just people. The whole idea of incentives is actually to help people get over that hump and give them another reason to try and get on with their activity. The experiments that have been done over the years in Vitality show that people do respond and they respond for the long term. They don't just, it's not 1 day or 2 days or 3 days. There are years and years of experience. We also know that people respond if you take things away from them that they want. A classic example is in parts of the world, people get an Apple Watch free when they sign up for life insurance under Vitality, and it stays free as long as they use their watch for activity. Now, even very wealthy people don't want to have to pay stuff for things that they could get free, and that behavioral motivation has a big impact. So I would say understanding even more how we deal with having better ways of making it easier for people to live their lives makes sense. And then thirdly, outside of the home and outside of the clinic is the broad environment, where people step out into a food environment where the cheapest food and is often very tasty, and it's more accessible to young people and to older people. And it starts explaining why we need to think about the regulatory and policy environment, which is something I've also dealt with, or think about the cities where it's very difficult to go for a walk or jog or run or find a place to do some physical activity because of the structural problems of not having thought that through in cities. And I could go on, but I think that why I feel positive is that there are many organizations and groups starting to address this. There are now 100 cities which are defined as resilient cities, trying to make livability healthy, fun, environmentally sustainable. Over the long term, that'll mean you won't have to think actively about it because you'll have more public transport, you'll have green spaces and so on. But that's a long way off. In the meantime, I think we do have to rely a lot more on the role of the physician, the role of the healthcare professional in really giving greater support to their patients around this. One of the interesting things I did with Vitality quite a few years ago, they had a group of the leading physician groups in the country, so the heads of obstetrics and gynae and pediatrics and all of them in the room, and our job was to inspire them about the value of prevention. And I'd been warned they were not particularly excited about prevention. So what we did was, most of them were members of Vitality. So we got their health status and their Vitality status, and we showed them the data that they were not doing too well, and that the doctors, for example, who smoked had twice the number of patients who smoked in their clinic, and that the weight of the doctor was proportionate to the weight of their patients. Wow. Of course, that started a fun discussion around the importance of the influence that professions can play and do play, subtly, overtly, sometimes not so subtly, on their patients. And I mention that because often we forget that that point of interaction between the doctor and the patient is one of the most profoundly important ones that can put people on a path to at least getting involved in prevention if the other elements are in place.
Brilliant. I want you to unpack this hyperbolic discounting, because I think it's very important as a concept, a behavioral concept for people to understand with regards to internal motivational, internal drivers with regards to sustainable change.
Yeah, so there's been substantial work done. Some of the most interesting work was done by a colleague at Yale with people at Discovery many years ago. And they did a very simple questionnaire, which went out to many members of Discovery across many insurance groups. And the question was a well-known question: if we give you $100 today, will you take it, or will you wait a month and we'll give you $150 or $180? Now, given that this is the only time you were asked that, the rational response would be to wait, and just wait, and then you're going to get a lot more money. About 15 to 20% of people opt for the short-term solution, give me the money now. So then the analysis was very interesting. Those people really were where all the obesity occurred, where the smoking rates were higher, where credit card repayments were worse, where mortgage repayments were most vulnerable, suggesting that people who generally have a more short-term perspective have a range of other behaviors that are against their long-term best interest. And that was the underlying logic that was behind helping them get over that inertia to actually do something that'll be positive. Now, the question is, how sustainable is that? And you talking about internal versus external. This is an external incentive. Well, does it still need to be internalized? There have been recent work showing that looking at people who got large incentives for healthy behavior, particularly for activity. This is not a discovery study. And the incentives reduced or actually went away. What happened to them? Did they all revert back to where they were? And the good news was no. Once people had entrenched their behavior as part of their habit, part of their lifestyle, part of the way that actually made the fundamental changes to realizing and enjoying and appreciating doing activity, healthy eating, and so on, it actually stuck. So it did have a high degree of stickiness, but it did take some time before they got achieved. And I think that's the other point, is that some of these behaviors we're expecting people to take are very, very tough from many points of view. So we went out also, again, another vitality study that we took 100,000 people in the US, and they were given an incentive to increase their steps by some modest amount, a few thousand a day. We knew they'd all increase them, or that wouldn't be difficult because they got an incentive for it. The question was, once they've increased their steps, are they more likely to go on to the more complex areas of behavior like weight management, smoking cessation, preventive screening? And the answer was yes, by a large amount, suggesting that when we throw all of this advice at patients who may be overweight and smoking and not active and expect them to do it all at once, we're going to fail. You have to take them through the journey, and the journey often starts easiest with increasing your physical activity modestly. Then you gain self-efficacy and you're feeling good. And the moment you're feeling good, you're naturally going to want to eat more healthily. You're naturally going to want to get screened. And I don't think we pay enough attention to that triggering effect. And that's why I believe very strongly that physical activity in the place of nutrition and obesity isn't important because it's going to directly lower your calories, because it won't, you know how much you've got to run to get rid of calories, but it's going to change your mindset and give you self-efficacy to do the tougher issues.
Yeah, that's very profound. And we found that in the corporates, we're working with the corporates for the last 3 years with interventions and programs. We've just realized if we start with incremental, small changes, steps has been one of our things, how many, hours you stand for. These small things, they seem, incidental, but they lead to major other changes in the person's life. Even, if we just look at basic sort of neurochemistry or neurotransmitters, endorphin release or release of dopamine, release of serotonin, achieving something, getting that win, that micro win, and that becomes along the journey, the steps of the journey. So that's pretty profound. Are these studies, discovery studies, and all this research available to the public or available to someone like this? Because I think this is pretty profound. I'm part of Discovery and Vitality. I think I've been a diamond member for, part of it, I don't know for how many years. We just live a very, very healthy lifestyle. So it just made sense for us. Although sometimes you get tired of dancing to Discovery's tune and the tunes that they change. But be that as may, that's what you got to dance to. And I think there's a brilliance behind it. But there is part of me, and maybe it's this internal family systems part of me. There's a part of me that does not want to be enslaved to rules and regulations with regards to my health. But overall, it's been good for my family, and we're all part of it, and it's been very beneficial. But tell me, are these studies available and this research available to us?
Yeah, no, all of the studies are in the public domain, but I think the question is, are they packaged and made accessible to the members in a way in which they can actually use them in their daily lives? And I think that is still a shortcoming. It's not surprising that often a company the size of Discovery is focused on expanding the business, strengthening the underlying financial dynamics, and gives less attention to the very critical need to market this and get it into hands of people. I think the other thing is that, I've seen after working with them, there obviously are gaps, and some of them are starting to be filled. One is mental health. I think we've all seen during the pandemic the profound impact of depression, anxiety, and the mixture between that and isolation. And the solutions there are not that easy. Getting people linked to a digital therapist is very nice, but that's not going to probably be sustainable. The medications, one of the things I did 20 years ago was the very first report by WHO on mental health. And, it showed that there was obviously a lot of problems. But over the last 20 years, the world has been flooded with medications, anti-anxiety and depression and so on. And yet the prevalence of most mental health conditions has not moved, suggesting that we're missing something. And that's something I keep struggling to think, well, what are we missing? And one of the things that does seem strange to talk about coming from somebody with a medical and a technology background is a lot of these spiritual dimensions of health, where we know, and by spiritual, I'm not just talking about organized religion, which itself does play a very powerful role. We know that people who go to either their church, their mosque, their synagogue on a regular basis have dramatically lower levels of depression and anxiety over life. We don't know whether it's specifically the prayer, but it probably certainly is the community, the fact that people are engaging and interacting with people. We know that people who engaged in other forms of spirituality, yoga, meditation, mindfulness, also show these enormous benefits. Yet we don't talk about that enough. And particularly now, I'm actually starting work at Yale where they have a small center for spirituality and health, believe it or not, within the medical school, because they know that the more we can involve people in these community-based interactive activities, the more likely they are to have benefits on mental health, go through cancer with requiring less side effects and have a range of cardiovascular benefits. So I think that the technologically rich approach we've taken needs to be complemented with a human-centric approach as well. And if we can get those two together, I think we'll be able to make a big difference. The empirical evidence that this matters, I think, was interesting. During the end of the pandemic, I worked with the BBC on a worldwide survey of mental health problems, how people were doing. That for the developed countries, the US, Europe, and so on, we were seeing very high levels of depression and anxiety. But for many Asian countries, particularly Vietnam, Thailand, Korea, we weren't. And it does seem that the structure of the society, the family, the caring system, the community support, which is inherently much stronger still in those cultures, is probably a very strong reason for the protective effect against anxiety and depression in the wake of the worst pandemic we ever had.
Sure. And so where do we start? I mean, back to this question, and I know there's so many facets. We're not going to be answering this in an hour or in a week, but I think if people are listening out there, and I think the latest stats in the US is 1 in 2 men are going to get cancer in their lifetimes, 1 in 3 women are going to get cancer in their lifetimes. I mean, when I say this to the corporates, and we've dealt with huge corporates here in South Africa, and looks like we're going to get some international work as well. It doesn't seem to affect them. It doesn't seem to change them. Sometimes I think awareness is the start of transformation. Sometimes I think awareness is just a stone that hits a brick wall and bounces back. I just came from Cyprus, where my parents moved 28 years ago, and where my roots are. And I've never been so traumatized going into a little bakery, having a coffee, and there where they're selling cigarettes are pictures on the boxes of patients having chemotherapy, and these very traumatic pictures of people that are absolutely decimated, significant sarcopenia, cachexia. It's just really just awful. I mean, my daughter of 7 saw this and said, what's that? What's happening there? There was this angst and this trauma. And I actually took pictures of it because I just thought, is this actually helping, people stop smoking in Cyprus? I think per capita, they're the second most smoking country in the world, or third, somewhere around there, Greece and Cyprus being up there, and using these marketing strategies of putting these traumatic pictures on boxes of cigarettes. And I'm sure you can speak into that. But the bottom line is, where are we going to start? Are we going to start, I was at a school, St. Stadium's, my old school. I did a keynote on health and wellness and being superhuman. And do we start making sure that they get a Apple Watch or a wearable where they just continue, walking 8,000 steps at least a day, just to start there, so we don't have multiple chronic diseases? Obviously, we're looking at the social impact of people and community, but if we can limit that, and they can walk possibly outside and get 8,000 steps and get some sunlight, and make sure those neurotransmitters in the morning are kicking in, and their cortisol, melatonin, cycle is mainly in check. Where do we start with this thing, this personal accountability, and sort of looking at this data-centric approach?
Yeah, I think all the things you mentioned make sense in some way. I mean, I still think the simplest things are often forgotten. And so I try and start my day when it's, depending on the weather, early in the morning, either with a walk or swim at dawn. And I'm sure that there are enormous benefits on serotonin, dopamine, seeing the awe of the sun rising and the beauty of the sea and the physical activity. And it's all of those, and particularly if you do it with friends. And so I think community-based sporting activities, not done because you're trying to get your heart rate up, but because you want to enjoy it, is often the start, particularly for young people, because the more they get just focused on the numbers, the steps, which will come naturally, they'll be doing it. They could very well do it in their room on a treadmill, and I don't think you'd have the same benefit of being out in nature, out with friends, and so on. So I do think that is an important issue from the personal point of view. Obviously, our school system doesn't really talk very much about the value of health and what happens over life. What you're doing in your early years while you're still in school often is setting the basis for what you're going to do. One of the most important things is around the time kids get going. And obviously in the teen years, it's difficult for kids to wake up because it's naturally tougher. But encouraging people to have greater focus on physical activity, I think, does set the scene for the long term. And we know that the kids who do that are less likely to get into a lot of the terrible drug-related issues we have now and later on obesity. But it's not going to be just on them and the schools. I think many parts of the world, obviously, we're seeing rising levels of obesity. In fact, I just had to review a piece which will come out in a few months, looking at the fact that every single country in the world is experiencing a rise in obesity, every country in the world. And only Spain has some suggestion of that it may be going down. For the rest, it's going up. And which are the worst in terms of obesity levels above 40%, which is unbelievable? The Middle East and North Africa. And by the way, Cyprus would also fall quite close into that. Small island states, and again, Cyprus is an island state, are the second big group, huge levels of obesity. The USA, particularly the Midwest, and South Africa. South Africa's doing very nicely. It may have won the World Rugby, the World Cup, but in terms of overall fitness of the nation, it's suffering badly. And I've always thought we need to have a new Olympics where it should be based not just on the individual athletes, but on the overall national performance, which is the fittest nation in the world should be able to win the Olympics. And then we'd find a very different set of players. Certainly the Norwegians and the Swedes and the Danes, probably a number of the Asian countries. But having that as part of a cultural desire, rather than just having your lead sports team win, I think could very well shift the focus.
Brilliant. So what are these countries doing? And Derek, if you're going to speak a message of hope and someone's listening saying, you know, I've got chronic disease, my parents had chronic disease, you know, I don't want my kids, you know, do we start with the social community aspect, as you said, okay, you know, keep up your activity. I know South Africa, in terms of their school system, at least they're pretty active, and sports are done by most, not everyone, but it's quite an active society. Do we get a watch on them to make sure that at varsity, you know, the booze and the drinking and the social lifestyles and the break in the circadian rhythm is not something that's compromised, you know? So where do we go with this? I mean, where does maybe even the Stats of Discovery saying, listen, these are the things we want to put in place. I mean, at Made to Thrive, we've got 7 pillars. We speak about community, we speak about purpose. The third one's environment, what environment you're putting yourself, nutrition, sleep, then movement, which includes exercise, and self-quantification, your awareness. You know, there's many people. I mean, I did a corporate program with a big company in South Africa, and the acting CEO hadn't had a medical in 9 years. When we looked at this, he was, you know, really on the brink of a serious event, and we had to act very, very quickly. But just give us a framework, give us a framework where someone's listening to say, okay, where do we start with this?
Well, I think we understand the kids issue, and I won't go into that, but one of the points I'll make is that, and it gives a sort of vision of where we're heading in the future. People who are getting close to 50 can look forward to 50 years of life expectancy, increasingly, which is extraordinary. So if that's the case, shouldn't you be restarting your preventive agenda at age 50 and look at the fact that while you may be overweight, you may be smoking, the opportunity to reverse a lot of the negative trends is fantastic at every age, all the way through 50s and 60s and even 70s. And you mentioned screening. We are seeing a revolution in screening for cancers and early cardiovascular disease and so on. And I think it's only going to accelerate, which means that you have to be in touch with your health system. And even as we're seeing concerns about cancer, the reason cancer death rates in some parts of the world are displacing cardiovascular isn't because necessarily cancer rates themselves are going up, but because cardiovascular treatment has got so much better. But even cancer now, it used to be many cancers were a death sentence. Now we're seeing survival well extending in all the solid tumors. Breast cancer now, a 95, 98% 5-year, 8-year survival rate if you've got good screening, if you've got good support. So I think there's good news coming out of the medical diagnostic era, but people have to take advantage of it. They need to understand that in the same way as you put so much energy in having your car regularly looked after, you need to have your body regularly looked after. And it's the accumulation of these outcomes accelerates after 50. So it does seem that we should have a reboot at age 50 and take all the preventive principles. I speak to a lot of people who say, well, it's too late. Well, it's actually not too late. Even if you've been a heavy smoker and you quit at age 50 or you get onto reduced risk products, your longevity it can be measured in terms of 7, 8, 9 years of extra life expectancy. Similarly, you can reverse obesity through a range of different measures, but there needs to be a strong push to do it.
Brilliant, brilliant. So I want to ask you just a personal question, just because I'm going into schools, doing a lot of keynotes and workshops and it seems like every second private school pupil is vaping. The difference between vaping and smoking, and this is just something on the side as I was thinking about it, and the long-term side effects. Is there benefit to vaping, and are there still side effects, or are the studies fully out to determine the effects of vaping?
Yeah, so, I spent many years in tobacco control, leading the WHO. And towards about 10 years ago, when I was actually at Vitality, I was asked by a British journal, The Spectator, to review what is going on in this new thing, vaping and snus, which is like a nicotine pouch now. And I went back to the literature and I was shocked that I had taken my eye off the ball. First thing you saw is that the heaviest users of snus, which is a smokeless product which doesn't give you anything except nicotine, and the Swedes use it, explain why the Swedish use of snus has almost completely displaced cigarettes. Smoking rate now in Sweden is the lowest in the world, under 5%. They use snus a lot, which has got nicotine, and their lung cancer and cancer death rates are the lowest in Europe by far. The cardiovascular death rates are about the lowest also in Europe by far, all suggesting when I wrote it that the effect of nicotine was not toxic, was going to be at most a very modest impact on health. But the real problem wasn't the nicotine, it was the combustible cigarette, it was the burning, the stuff that gets burnt and goes into your lung. So when I left, I then started working on this foundation where we went into this in great detail. And I'd say the evidence is now very strong. The US FDA has authorized what they called appropriate for the protection of public health, e-cigarettes, snus, nicotine pouches, and heated tobacco products, as all dramatically lowering your exposure to the toxic aspects of a cigarette or as a smokeless tobacco product. The question then is not whether you're going to have less exposure to bad stuff, but what are the long-term effects? And of course, these products, some of them haven't been around. Snus has been around for 60 years. We know that there are no long-term effects to worry about, which means that nicotine pouches will also have no long-term effects, only positive effects, and there may be surprising positive effects. We know that the more you use nicotine, the lower your level of Parkinson's disease, the lower your level of ulcerative colitis, the better memory retention, ADHD, a range of issues actually benefit, but we haven't been able to talk about that while it was still wrapped, the nicotine was wrapped up in a deadly cigarette. Now that you're separating the two, we need to educate the public and the physicians about the difference between nicotine as an active ingredient that has very few effects in adults that are not positive, as opposed to toxic combustible cigarettes. I just worked on a report actually that included South Africa, where we tried to ask the question, if South Africans the smokers were to switch from combustible cigarettes to use a number of technologies, whether it was an e-cigarette or a nicotine pouch, or better cessation over the next 30 years, how many lives would be saved in South Africa? And we started doing the calculations, and they come up to about 330,000 lives over the next few decades, which is almost the same amount who died when Mbeki failed to put in place the antiretroviral policies of those years. Why we did these studies is to show that it's not inevitable that we are going to continue to have death rates from smoking at such a high level. The e-cigarette concern has been predominantly one around kids and around long-term addiction. Much of the worry that kids will start on an e-cigarette and go on to a cigarette have been totally disproved. There is no evidence of that. In fact, it does suggest that kids who start on an e-cigarette are more likely to quit all forms of nicotine at twice the rate of anything else on the market, including nicotine replacement therapy. And this is not my evidence. This is the big British studies, the Cochrane Review, and so on. So in summary, I think that my colleagues in public health have got this badly wrong in many cases, mainly because they are so fearful that this is another tobacco industry gimmick or trick. Yet it's a profound shift in how people consume nicotine. And I anticipate over the next 10 years, we will see more and more people who are using combustible cigarettes move to these products. I'll just end with saying on that, but in Japan, the proportion of people who smoke cigarettes who now are using heated tobacco products has dropped by 50% in 7 years, due to no government intervention, but due to consumers recognizing the value of these products. The evidence is already accumulating that that means the chronic obstructive airways disease rates and eventually the cancer rates are going to come down quite fast. Same data we now have in the UK for e-cigarettes, or the US for e-cigarettes, or for Europe for nicotine pouches. These are a set of interventions which could have huge impacts on mortality and morbidity. But as I said, they're not fully yet embraced by the public health community, who have a lot of these fearful concerns.
Oh, thanks for that summary. Fascinating and enlightening, even for someone like myself who's been concerned. I suppose my concern is from a psychological addiction point of view. If these people are using this external substance to deal with anxiety and to deal with, you know, just the struggles of life, and not building other resilient ways to deal with these things. But that's another conversation which I think we can have. Just really thank you for that informative sort of, you know, explanation of the importance of moving from combustibles to e-cigarettes and vapes. Let's talk about wearables, Dr. Derek, and AI and the future of health, and how wearables are really going to help prevent disease or monitor disease, and be able to manage disease far better, and the shift possibly to home care away from hospitals that are very expensive and costly. Give us your perspective on the future. I mean, I know that we use the Whoop and Aura with our clients. I mean, the feedback we get is remarkable, that they now got awareness. Awareness is the start, and it's been great for a lot of them to see, hang on, you know what, I thought I was like sleeping for 7 hours, but actually I was in my bed for 9 hours, and the amount of sleep I actually got was like under 6 hours. So it's been pretty transformative to bring awareness to people. Obviously, being concerned about some people that become orthorexic regarding this and become absolutely obsessed with the data and the numbers, which is, a downside and a risk to have a data-centric model. But give us the future on wearables and the use of AI to manage and prevent disease.
Yeah, I think we had a very exciting time. So one of the things we did in the Vitality Institute was to go to the Alternative Futures Network people in Palo Alto and put together a team to ask the question, what is the future of wearables? And what's going to be on the horizon for the next 10 years? The fascinating news was everything that was on the horizon by then for 10 years is already in effect today. So this is a very fast-moving area. I mean, obviously, Apple, I'm a Garmin user. Many I prefer the swim aspects of Garmin. But I think that everything you said about self-awareness, knowing how active you are, triggering you, I saw even in my own family, my wife was very resistant to the use of these because first she thought she doesn't want to be told and overly monitored, but it stimulated her now to be more active. My son, who's 20, is training for his first marathon, and this is his trainer. It's a new way of thinking and life, and AI built into the system allows him to know his speed, his time, his velocity, his post-training requirements for him personally, and how is his heart responding, how's his recovery going, and a range of other things. This is already being built in. One of the most exciting initiatives, which shows where Apple is thinking of the future, is in the UK, where the largest cohort is being assembled of 5 million people who are going to be followed for 30 years. They're already starting to be followed, about 800,000, to look at what are the positives and the negatives of using sensors, early diagnostics. How do you stimulate those and integrate them? The study is funded partly by the British NHS, partly by Apple, partly by the pharmaceutical industry, suggesting this integration of the public interest, the wearable world, early diagnostics and so on, as well as your own activity, and potential new products and services for us. Already in the area of mental health, for example, AI is playing a big role in trying to actually have algorithms when you can go online and get a decent diagnosis, which is going to change, and something that's personalized to you in terms of how best to move forward. And I see that just expanding. I think part of the problem was that when some of the early AI stuff started with Watson, which was the effort by folk at GE to actually have a cancer AI system developed for all cancers, it didn't yield the results that were wanted because it was probably too early. But now, I think AI as a guide is moving very fast. There's a very interesting university which was built a few years ago in Roosevelt Island, in the middle of the East River of the US, which is a partnership between Cornell, a very strong computer group, and the Technion in Israel, as it's called Cornell Tech. Their global health head is a computer scientist, and their head of mental health is also a computer scientist. She comes out of MIT, and they're using advanced AI systems to anticipate who needs to get better care in rural East Africa, doing this sitting in the East River of New York, because people have got access to different types of wearables, different type of monitoring of their systems, and the linkage to the health system. What is the optimal way to do it? The combination of AI and better geolocation, better ways to stimulate people are all converging in healthcare, and I think starting to have real benefits. They're doing the same in the area of mental health, starting to look at how facial expression, voice changes, the way you walk, all are powerful predictors of underlying subtle and often early mental health conditions. I've been working with a group who are looking at early means of detecting a cognitive decline or cognitive issues, which use a range of AI-driven tests on a regular basis that for you you go back to that test on a regular basis, and as problems arise, automatically people get alerted. I think in the area of suicide prevention, and suicide is a huge issue worldwide among young people, a real tragedy. Well, we now know that the way people search online, the kind of messaging in social media, are all able to be used as predictors of a pending suicide attempt, allowing people to intervene. The new sophisticated 988, we have 911 for police, but we now have the new 988 suicide line, is going to have a lot of these AI features built into it. And already in the first couple of months of testing it, we're talking about 150,000 people every week dialing in, of which maybe 15, 20,000 are in profound need of support, and some will go on to commit suicide. Anything we can do to actually avoid that and prevent and alert and detect is going to make a difference. So I think we're just the start of a new way of thinking. And of course, it's not going to displace the current physicians and doctors. It's going to require they become much more upscaled in terms of how they use it and how they engage with the individuals at the end of the line.
So, wow, fantastic summary there in terms of the wearables and how they're going to really help us in the future. Last question, because we're coming to the end of the show, and is really about health coaches. Derek, I've got a number of health coaches in my organization that are trained, some of them US trained, with different functional medicine groups and certifications. And the chasm between doctors and patients, I think, is growing. I think the average time that a GP spends with a patient in South Africa in private care is 12 minutes. I think it's 7 minutes in the US, something to those numbers. But the role of health coaches in giving someone a certification to walk alongside a patient, to explain the data, to pick diagnostic sort of tests that they're well versed in and direct them to the right professional. What is your view on health coaches in the future?
Yeah, again, I think the health coach armed with good AI and good digital information is fundamental. As I think, because as we know that a lot of the doctors, particularly as they become more super specialists, which you want them to be, are going to be focusing on the technique and the technology and not on the whole patient. Whereas the coach can really be concerned with the whole person and the human-centric approach. And there's some things which always seem to fall through the cracks that we've already raised. Somebody going through advanced cardiovascular treatment or cancer treatment generally doesn't get the support in terms of mental health, diet and nutrition. What is the optimal diet and nutrition for them? And how do you have their hands held? Encouragement of physical activity and addressing the fears. I mean, I think that the downside of the better diagnostics we have is we're going to have a lot of people who are going to be false positive. So they're going to be not have the condition that initially they were screened to have. That creates enormous anxiety. And I think a health coach can help people get on and get beyond it. But I think the ability to access resources outside of the traditional clinical area, whether it's community resources, physical activity, whatever works for them, and diet and nutrition, the quality of diet and nutrition advice in most of the medical and physician areas is very weak. It's not part of the strong core. And people want to know about supplements and other things and what is the best diet for me. I think that's where health coaches can have a big benefit. So absolutely, I think that's a very important role going forward.
Brilliant. Dr. Derek, I want to just declare favor and blessing over you. Thank you for your time, your wisdom. You're a man who keeps on learning, keeps on growing. Yes, you might have taken many positions, but boy, has it formulated something in you? Has it formed something in you? Has it molded something in you that is really profound? So thank you for your time, your wisdom, and wishing you the best in the future. And thank you for your impact in South Africa and just your continual care for this country and concern for this country and input into this country, because I think we really need it.
Thank you. It's been a real privilege, Steve, and hope to be back before long and see you in person in South Africa before long.